Anyway, I've got two things to discuss today. The reign of King Stephen, briefly, which is what this indicates, and we'll look at the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland, traditionally dated to 1169. But before we begin, let's say a bit about what and who the Angevins were. After the Normans, and usually people refer to Stephen as a Norman king, though in a sense his distance from his grandfather William, who was a real Norman, is the same as Henry II's distance from Henry I in terms of through a mother. So both are in theory equally Norman or not Norman or Norman or whatever. But the Angevins the Capetians are the guys ruling in France. So
okay, this is no, I'm sorry.
This is Capetian.
I thought we were for some reason I thought Angevins were.
They are French, and I'll explain how. But they're French guy, a different bunch of French guys ruling England in a sense, though they're all related. So the name Angevin, the word Angevin, comes from Anjou, which is this county here. Okay. And it's because the father of King Henry II, and Henry II himself, of course, was Count of Anjou. So these are the Anjou kings as opposed to the Norman kings. The family are sometimes Plantage. Well, I kind of also sometimes called Plantagenets, which is a nickname which one of the later descendants, one of the guys descended from King John, had, and then they give the name backwards to the others. So sometimes we say Angevin, sometimes these are the first Plantagenet kings, but in this period we usually use the word Angevin. So it's, in theory, a new dynasty, a new... we have more. Welcome, Hochgilden is. Usually seen in some ways as a new dynasty, but there's a female link there, so you can regard that in one way or another. And I've added a few extra names on here. This is similar to the one we had up last time, but I've added some. Maybe for Thursday's class we might mention some of Henry II's other sons, and I've added also in Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who was illegitimate son of Henry I. Okay. So let's look at, and yes, the main point about the Angevins, and essentially this means kind of Henry II himself, as I hope we'll hear in the presentation on Thursday, is that in addition to ruling England, and something sticky on the floor here, and kind of being lord of Ireland, as we shall describe, and having some powers in Wales, Henry, in addition to Normandy and Anjou and the areas that Anjou kind of coveted, okay, also acquires by different means, we'll talk about this on Thursday, acquires significant land in the south of France, creating this continuous stretch of land from the north right down to the Spanish border that was ruled by the King of England, while the Capetian kings of France directly, I mean, they were, as we said, the lords of all these dukes and so on, but effective power was the Ile-de-France, this region around Paris. And it's during this time that we gradually see the power of the French kings extending. But the most powerful person in France was, in fact, Henry II, and not the King of France for a while. Okay, but as a background to that, we need to look at the reign of King Stephen, who is traditionally seen as one of the sort of bad kings or whatever in English history. So, Henry I dies, some kind of food poisoning, I think, okay, overeating while he's in Normandy. And the situation, therefore, becomes slightly complicated, slightly problematic. Henry's legitimate son had died, so he had named Matilda, his daughter, as his heir. And the Anglo-Norman nobles had recognized her, had accepted this, that she would be Henry's heir. Okay? And Stephen, who was in England at that time, was one of the people who had already recognized her or accepted this decision by King Henry. But when Henry dies, Stephen gets a certain amount of support. Okay? He gets support from the noblemen, and at a certain point he gets papal support, and he's able to get himself, within a few weeks, made King of England. Okay? Because he was William I's grandson. Okay? His mother was daughter of William. He had an older brother called Theobald, but it seems he wasn't so keen on the English throne, or at least he didn't want to get involved in fighting or something, so he's not a significant kind of candidate. So primarily, there are some people supporting. Hi, come, my cup overfloweth here. This is great. So we have Stephen, who's in theory going against his previous promise to support Matilda, but pressing his own case. And of course we have Matilda married to the Count of Anjou, who claims that she was recognized as heir and she should be that. Okay. Stephen gets the throne, and for the first few years, okay, seems to be in a fairly good position, but he gradually alienates the noblemen, Anglo-Norman nobles, barons as they're called sometimes. Okay, so for example, initially he has support or tacit support from Matilda's half-brother, Robert, who is Earl of Gloucester. Okay, but then, as you see, after a few years, Robert renounces his fealty, his faithfulness as a vassal to Stephen, okay, and shifts his support to Matilda. And he's quite an important figure. Robert is an important person. So she now is pressing her case, and ultimately she's pressing the case for her quite young son. He's a young boy, ultimately, okay. She wants to press her claim to have him eventually become king. Meanwhile, Stephen has papal support. Okay, the Lateran Council under the Pope recognizes Stephen as king. But also in the same year, 1139, Matilda, with the support of Earl Robert, okay, arrive on the coast of England, okay, and Matilda is allowed to get, let's get a map of England now, is taken and uses as her base Bristol, which is here. Okay, this is Gloucestershire here. This is the area that Robert is fairly powerful. So Matilda is brought to Gloucester, Bristol. Then we have the beginning of what we call the Anarchy. Big T and big A of Stephen's reign. Okay, a series of battles and fighting between these two sides, between King Stephen and the supporters of Matilda, including Robert. So in 1140, okay, there's an attempt at establishing peace, but Stephen doesn't accept the terms, the offers, so the fighting continues. 1141, very important, the Battle of Lincoln, where Stephen is not only defeated, but he's actually captured. Okay, the enemy, Matilda and her supporters, capture him, okay, and put him in prison. And the person who basically saves the day is Stephen's wife, Matilda, who is Countess of Boulogne. And she continues pressing his case and eventually defeats the enemy in Winchester and in turn captures Robert. And then the two guys are exchanged later in the year. Okay, you give me Robert and I'll give you Stephen in return. And so he's re-established as king. Push that one up. Stephen then presses his case forward, 1142, okay, besieges Matilda in Oxford, and she flees to nearby Wallingford. And then, for a period of 3 to 4 years, as I've put here, stalemate. What does that mean? Stalemate, do you know what that means? Yes, it's a balance. No one can win further, okay? So there's relative peace, there's fighting going on, but no one is kind of winning outright. 1147, Robert Earl of Gloucester dies, and in the following year, Matilda returns to Normandy. So Stephen's position is clear. There's an attempt during this time by Henry, but it doesn't come to anything, to come and reassert his position. He's getting older now. And then in 1153, this is a very important year, Henry, who is now has Normandy as well, so he's Duke of Normandy, arrives in England, and in the same year, the son and heir, recognised heir of King Stephen dies, Eustace, okay? And he had another son, but eventually they form an agreement. Henry and Stephen form what's called the Treaty of Winchester. Stephen recognises Henry as his heir instead of his other son. And then in the next year, Stephen dies, and then legally Henry becomes king. So Stephen provides a kind of stopgap between the proper Normans and then the Angevins, in a sense. And again, it's this struggles for succession which lead to problems during his reign. So then we move into Henry II, and we'll follow the details of his reign on Thursday, and either Zeynep or Altai, I'm not sure what we'll talk about. What's the situation? What have we decided? Because Zeynep had the...
Will present Richard lineup.
Yeah, because you both wanted to do that, but she had the books.
Yeah.
So we thought we may as well leave the books with her. So what's your subject going to be?
I'm thinking for presenting this Henry II.
Right, okay.
Or if you have suggestions for me.
Well, that's I think what we kind of more or less suggested. So that's what I've worked around. So we'll need to do a lot of work, and you need to. Are you free tomorrow afternoon, anytime? What time? Yeah, because I'll be in my history office earlier in the afternoon between 1:30 and 3:30.
Okay.
So if you can come and see me then, show me what ideas you've got, what you've prepared, then I can give you some advice so that you can then have it ready for Thursday. Okay. Okay.
Can we talk about Anglo's list?
Yeah, as I run, I have to go and get my kids from school, so you'll walk very quickly with me back to my history office where I'll dump the stuff. So that'll give us 5 minutes to talk on the way. Okay, so Altai will do Henry II. Okay, so we'll pick up the story there. So, as I said, unfortunately, Stephen ends up with a kind of negative reputation, and obviously Anarchy, which is one of these things which the historians debate in one way or another, is an important aspect of that, amongst other things, and alienation of the noblemen and so on. But it's an important reign within this sequence of kings that we're looking at. Okay, any questions there? Any thoughts? Okay, the other thing I wanted to do today we have half an hour, but I don't know if it'll take us that long, is to look at what's going on in Ireland. And we're jumping ahead of ourselves a little bit because we'll be dealing with the reign of Henry, but it's probably the best time to do it. So here is one of my previous maps of Ireland. It's showing the Viking raids. We've looked at this one before, but it'll be sufficient for our purposes. Let's just remind ourselves a little bit. Can anyone remember what this area here is called? Anyone remember this region here? This is kind of the most important region for what we're going to be discussing today. This part of Ireland down here, kind of including Ossory from this way, is called Leinster Lane in Ireland and Irish. This area here, next to it, is Munster. This is Connacht or Connacht up here. Okay. Then we've got Meath mentioned here. We've got the southern O'Neill's Enale here, the northern Enale up there, and Ullath is Ulster, okay, which of course is where Britain still has political power in Ireland today. Okay, it's the last bit of that story in a sense. So, as you remember, Ireland in the early Middle Ages was divided up into these provinces, these fifths as we call them. Okay, we mentioned the main regions now, and those fifths were in turn broken up into smaller kingdoms, and the ruling dynasties of these different smaller kingdoms would take it in turns, in effect, to be the overlords or provincial kings of the whole province. So different groups of Jóganachta would at different times be kings of Munster, for example. And for a while, the guys down here, the Kenselig, were kings of Leinster, though it was their cousins in further north who ruled Leinster most of the time, and so on. And we talked about this before. And what about the concept of the High King of Ireland, or sometimes called the King of Tara, which is there in the centre there? What was that? Can anyone remember what the High Kingship was or wasn't? It doesn't mean some Irish guy smoking drugs and things, I'm high.
But didn't we mean, or didn't we say that he's not, I mean, the title says High King, but he's not necessarily king of all the area?
Yes, it's a concept which to some extent is pushed back in time, and by the 11th century you do get very, very powerful kings, such as, I mean, the example we talked about was Brian Boru from, well, originally Dalcash from Munster, who was able to perhaps gain allies from elsewhere that would kind of make him the most powerful king in Ireland. But it didn't make him king of Ireland. He had, in theory, no legal power over the others, but his military strength gave him kind of dominance in a sense. And people like him could claim to be the Ard Rí, the High King, but it didn't make them kind of king in the sense that Henry II was king of England or something like that. And then they pushed this back into the earlier period and used this title as if it was kind of a kingship of Ireland. But what these people did was they were more powerful overlords than some of the others and so on. But by the period we're looking at, when we get into the 12th century, it becomes an important concept, and we'll see that as we go along. And with the notable addition by the Vikings of what? What was the main Viking contribution to the political or demographic situation in Ireland when we talked about this map? And remember, what did they do? Remember, in England we had all those dots showing large-scale settlement by Vikings in the north and east of what is now England. What was the pattern in Ireland primarily? Anyone remember?
Along the coastline.
Yeah, that's right.
One of the main cities that they established.
They formed originally temporary short-term bases from which then to do things in Ireland, and in the long run the most famous of these was Dublin itself, which isn't actually marked on this map but it's here, but other places like that include, say, Wicklow and Waterford, most significantly, Limerick and so on. And then these bases become more and more permanent and they become like small towns, and then they gain a little hinterland, a little region presumably around them, and some of them, like Dublin and Waterford, form little kingdoms, very small regions. So it's a kind of an additional feature. The Irish political scene continues with these provinces and kingdoms and sub-kingdoms, and the Vikings add to that these little town-based kingdoms. And Dublin controlled quite a significant little region around there, for example. So that's the main kind of background, just as a reminder. What's sometimes called the Anglo-Norman, but I suppose should be called Angevin, because it happened during Henry II's reign, the Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland was different from what we saw in England, 1066. In 1066, we see the Duke of Normandy saying, I should be king of that kingdom, coming in, defeating Harold, and then establishing himself as king of the whole region. Okay, it's a one-person job, okay, to press his legal claim, and it involves the whole kingdom. He's not saying, I want to be king in this part of England, but not this part. He wants to become king of the whole of England. It's a royal thing. What happens in Ireland is a rather different kind of a story, okay, as we shall see. There's a royal element, but to a large extent, it is noblemen, individual noblemen, working kind of for the king, but primarily for themselves, establishing themselves in parts of Ireland that create what we call Anglo-Norman Ireland. So it's a different process in a sense. But it could have been similar. You can see I've started here quite a long way ahead of the main invasion over 10 years earlier. 1155, the Pope, who was the only ever English Pope, we've had one English man who's been a Pope, and this English Pope issues a bull, a document, a declaration called Laudibiliter, which basically says that Henry can invade Ireland because the Irish church is in a big mess, so they need Henry, who obviously is meant to be a good Christian, to go in there and sort things out. So he's got this papal bull, which in theory gives him the power to invade Ireland. But he's got plenty of other things on his plate, so he doesn't actually do that. Okay, this is the beginning of his reign. He's establishing himself in England. Now we move to the Irish situation. I'll take this slowly. We've got plenty of time. During the 1150s and 60s, there was a power struggle for supremacy between a number of Irish kings and their supporters. So we have Muirchertach Mac Lochlin, who was king of Islay. So he's the northern Enel. He's up here. He's the becoming more and more powerful group right up there in the north. Okay, and he is supported by a guy called Dermot Mac Murrochtha, or Murrah, okay, who's king of Leinster. And MacLachlan is struggling against Rory O'Connor, who's king of Connacht here. And his main supporter, amongst others, is another Connacht guy, Tiernan O'Rourke, who's king of Breffni, which is kind of on the edge of Connacht. Okay, so you've got a power struggle between two big, powerful kings, one in Leinster, one in sorry, not Connacht, between the Northern Inel and his supporter against the Connacht guys. Okay, a power struggle going on. To complicate things, MacMurrough in 1152 abducts, runs away with Dervgilla, who was wife of O'Rourke, the King of Breffni. That's why we mention him here. And it's likely that she, in fact, was not really abducted, but she was quite happy for this arrangement. But eventually she gets returned to her husband. So there is, in addition to a political, there's a kind of personal animosity between these groups of people as well. Now, in 1166, MacLachlan, the big guy in the north, the Northern Inel guy, dies. So no one is able to oppose O'Connor becoming High King. He establishes himself as the most powerful king in Ireland. And as a result of this, the Leinster guy, MacMurrough, is reduced in power to a very small region, and eventually he flees to England and then to France to try and get support from Henry II. He says, "Can't you help me get my kingdom back? This is a terrible thing," or whatever, and if you come across, I'm sure we can help you as well. Henry says, "I'm very busy at the moment, okay? I've got all sorts of things on my plate. I'm not really interested in Ireland, but if any of my noblemen wish to go over to Ireland and help you, then that's fine. Okay, I've got no problem with that." So Henry doesn't get involved at the start, but he permits his vassals, Normans and other Frenchmen, guys in England and Wales, if they want, to help him. So in the next year, 1167, with the help of some Normans and Welsh and some Flemings as well, MacMurrough tries to re-establish himself in Ireland, but gets defeated by the Connacht guys. Okay, that's unsuccessful. 2 years later, in May 1169, he launches the main invasion. Okay, initially capturing Wexford, and then manages to defeat with the Connacht guys as well, and becomes re-established in Leinster. So he becomes King of Leinster once again. The following year, so that's the main invasion, that's the initial invasion, and so it's not even something that the Normans are doing for their own purposes. They're doing it in theory to support an Irish king. An Irish king invites the Normans in effect, and obviously once they're in, they're not going to leave. So it's a very different process, as we said. Then, very important figure emerges, who's been involved already but hasn't been into Ireland yet. This is a guy called Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, who is Earl of Pembroke, which is in South Wales. And he's usually known by his nickname or alias, Strongbow. And in August 1170, Strongbow arrives, and very shortly afterwards he's able to capture Waterford from the sort of Scandinavian Irish that are there. And shortly after that, he marries Aoife, who is daughter of King MacMurrough of Leinster. Okay? And although he has a nephew, I think, a relative who could succeed him as King of Leinster, MacMurrough says that Strongbow, his son-in-law, is now heir to Leinster. So someone who is not Irish is being promised this important Irish province or over-kingdom. And then, significantly, in the following month, Strongbow and his supporters capture Dublin as well. Okay, so they're spreading their power. And you notice what they're doing is arriving at these Irish ports, at these Irish places, Waterford and Dublin. They're using these towns as the basis for their activity. In the following year, 1171, Dermot MacMurrough dies, and legally Strongbow becomes King of Leinster. But there is some resistance to this development amongst the native Irish, okay, particularly the guys in the north. And for a while, Strongbow is besieged at Dublin. So a lot of his conquests are reverted. Things could have fallen apart. And he's besieged at Dublin, but he defeats them and escapes from Dublin. It's at this point, in 1171, that King Henry decides to step in. So now it changes from individual, independent Norman guys, and the most significant one here is Strongbow, as we said, but others involved as well. Now the king is coming, and he's coming in as their lord, okay, but they've already made some conquests and gains, okay, which he cannot necessarily take away. So he's got to come in and kind of take control of the situation in Ireland. So as a result, quite a lot of the Irish kings and princes, leaders, submit to Henry and recognise him as Lord of Ireland. They hope that he will somehow impose some order on what is a rather difficult and complex situation. He's obviously a very powerful military figure with his great army. No one could oppose him as such, so they hope he will stop what some of these Anglo-Norman noblemen are doing and so on. Strongbow is affirmed in Leinster. King Henry recognises that Strongbow is king of Leinster, but recognises that position as his vassal. So Henry is the lord, and Strongbow, king of Leinster, is the vassal of Henry. Okay. And in addition, to provide a kind of counter to Strongbow's position, another nobleman, Hugh de Lacy, is given Meath, this region here, and is appointed justiciar. What's that? We mentioned that word last time. What does the office of justiciar mean?
Kind of be like the equivalent of vizier. Like he's like the king's like right hand man.
Kind of thing, and particularly when the king's not there. Okay, when the king isn't in England, someone else rules on his behalf. Okay, so this is the justiciar in Ireland. So when King Henry isn't in Ireland, which he obviously isn't most of the time, he appoints someone else, in this case Hugh de Lacy, to look after things for him. So we've got this strange situation. We've got Anglo-Norman noblemen taking over parts of Ireland, in effect, either by military means, or in the case of Strongbow, by marriage, and we've also got the king coming in and trying to impose some control over this, both over the Irish as well as the Anglo-Normans that are his vassals. So it's a kind of complicated situation. Sticky floors. In 1175, there is what's known as the Treaty of Windsor, when O'Connor, okay, our man from Connacht, is recognised by Henry as High King of Ireland, given this sort of slightly important title. So he has power, in theory, as overlord of all of Ireland, except for certain areas, most significantly Leinster and Meath, okay, these areas that the Anglo-Normans have got direct power over, and some of the towns, Waterford and Dublin, I think, are royal towns. They're under Henry's power. And in return, he has to pay tribute to Henry II. 1176, Strongbow dies. 1177, we have further developments. Firstly, a new guy on the scene, John de Courcy, again from an Anglo-Norman, makes his move right up the north into Ulster, okay, and establishes himself up there. And in the same year, it's decided to make John, the young son of King Henry, to make him Lord of Ireland. So Henry gives up the title Lord of Ireland and passes it to his young son, who's got very little. He's kind of dividing and ruling his sons, giving them various responsibilities and powers, okay, in order to maintain his position and so forth. It's almost 10 years, it's 8 years later before John actually makes his first visit to Ireland and arrives and travels around some of the towns and visits his region, okay, and during his own reign he comes back later on. And then a little bit later on, we go to details here, this is going beyond what we're looking at now, but at the beginning of the 13th century, more and more areas, the big 12th and 13th century, we see more and more areas coming under the control of the Anglo-Normans, including in 1135, Connaught itself is conquered. So there's a nice colourful map, which I found from, of all places, Wikipedia, where the green represents the regions by about, this is the end of the 13th century, the regions that were still under independent native Irish Gaelic control. So that's what now are called the O'Neills rather than just the Northern Email up here in the north, and the most western extreme parts of Munster and a few other little regions dotted around here. But as you can see, the brown colour represents the parts of Ireland which were ruled by, well, it says here Normans, it's no longer a good phrase, Anglo-Normans, either by the king or by, in most cases, Anglo-Norman noblemen. And by this time, these noblemen, many of them are the Fitzes that we mentioned, Fitzpatricks, Fitzgeralds and all these things, the Fitz coming in as an Irish surname. These people have become, they form a new element in the Irish situation. So they become what we call Anglo-Norman or Anglo-Irish rulers. So they're integrated into the scene. They're not native Irish, but they're now rulers in their own right, in a sense. And the lordship of Ireland continues down into the modern period and is a complicated thing because you get regions controlled by independent noblemen. As I said, you also have the king and his claims to be Lord of Ireland imposed on it as well. So the Irish situation, not too different from what we saw in Wales, where parts of Wales, but not on quite such a big scale initially, coming under royal or noble Norman control. And that's the situation that will continue for quite a long time into the Middle Ages afterwards. Okay, any questions on that? Any thoughts? So when Altai wakes up, when Altai does his presentation on Thursday, you can mention a bit about Ireland, but we've covered mainly Ireland, so we'll focus on what Henry is doing in England, but also we can look at the Angevin Empire as well. Okay. Anything else? Any questions? No? Okay, we'll finish early then today. These are the two things I wanted to look at. And I'm thinking, so we've got the class on Thursday, and then next week, because of Domus Gribi or whatever, they've decided to cancel the other classes, so we won't have a Tuesday class, and we won't have a Thursday class because it's Bayram then anyway. So there's going to be a kind of 2-week, or as a whole week holiday in a sense, or whatever. For you guys, if you look carefully at the email that we all received, it says no classes, but academic and administrative units carry on their work as normal. So you can do whatever you want, okay? But we have to be in our offices or whatever, things like that. Fair enough, okay? But minimize interaction between infected people, I suppose, or something like that. But the library will be working full-time, except on the main Bayram day, so you can come and do your research in the library whenever you want. We're happy to see you. But I'm trying to think, we won't see each other next week, so then it's going to be, well, it's going to be effectively December. And we will have about 3 or 4 weeks effectively left after that to finish our topics and to work on your papers. So I'm going to think again about at what point I'll need to see some kind of draft papers from you all, okay? Not just bibliographies, but clear drafts, because the whole purpose is to make sure we don't end up panicking at the end of the course and running out of time to write a good paper and things like that. But we can talk about that maybe on Thursday if we've got time. Okay, thank you very much. See you all on Thursday. And Altai, okay, I'm deliberately finishing a bit early because we finished, but we've got slightly longer. I can walk more slowly to my office and we can talk about your presentation.
Did you